This is a very, very informal hour you'll spend with us if you spend the whole hour with us. We call it a Scotch Talk because it's supposed to indicate the informality of the occasion, and we are drinking Scotch. I have mine. Chris has his. I think Scott is passing on the Scotch today.
Yeah.
It's beer. Okay.
A little beer. Yeah.
Probably more appropriate. We are not as committed to drinking during the day as you would believe from this occasion. In fact, I'm fairly certain I speak for all of us when we're generally not drinking at least hard booze in the early afternoon on a Thursday in a work week, Chris and me. So I just want everybody to know that. But I blame Katie Janis, my colleague here who runs these things for us, for coming up with this concept and always leading me to have some Glenlivet 12-year, I think is what I have here during these talks. So it's casual. Our topic today is capital campaigns. And really, you can ask anything you want in the chat about capital campaigns. Just sort of leading up to some other things we have happening here in a little while. We have a webinar on capital campaigns on May 6th. If you want to register for that, you can do that at the American Philanthropic website. That's on capital campaigns, the deliberation, when to start, how much to raise, how long should it last, and how do we get ready. That'll be more formal. It's a webinar. It'll be a little more structured than this will be. And then on May 20th, we have a masterclass on capital campaigns, longer, more involved, more structured yet. And that is about how to advance your mission with a successful capital campaign. And both of those events will involve people who are more expert than me. That's good for you. So we go up the ladder from here. I'm at the bottom of the ladder. Scott and Chris, I think, will be with us maybe all the way with these things, but not me. So today, though, we are going to talk about how capital campaigns require grit, and does your organization have it? Scott Bucko, my colleague here, who's run many a capital campaign in his career for churches and schools and other entities, wrote a great article for us on this topic in Philanthropy Daily, philanthropydaily.com. If you're interested, we publish a lot of stuff there, practical stuff as well as think stuff. So we're going to use that article to structure our conversation, and then we'll be very free flowing after that. And we'll get to as many questions as we can in the chat during and after we get through this. Chris Kuetemeyer runs our capital campaigns group out of Denver. Scott's in Philadelphia, by the way. Chris is in Denver. I'm in Phoenix. Chris also has broad experience in fundraising, everything that you can do in fundraising. I think he's done and led, but has really focused a lot on capital campaigns for us here at American Philanthropic over the last several years. And so thank you guys for joining us today. Appreciate it.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here. So
great.
You know, there's somebody else from Philadelphia, somebody in the chat box, somebody from the University of Pennsylvania, noting that they're in their last 90 days of a multi-billion-dollar campain.
Wow. Just going to comment on that and say that maybe Lynn should be one of our experts here on this call, rather than somebody who's merely attending. But thank you, Lynn, for joining us, and maybe you can enlighten us with a lot of what you've learned. We have people come from all backgrounds on these calls. I've noticed, I went through the registrant list earlier, people who maybe don't know much about capital campaigns to people maybe who are doing multi-billion-dollar capital campaigns. So we'll try to connect with everybody. My speaker's going crazy here. I'm sorry. We'll try to touch on all levels of capital campaign stuff. All right, let's get going. So, Scott, we'll start with you. Capital campaigns require grit. You say that people should do a grit check before they start doing a capital campaign. I will absolve you from being a little cheesy on the grit check thing rather than gut check thing. It's a little cheesy, but it's okay.
Thank you. Excuse me.
We're not trying to be that cheesy, but we go through five things to kind of check in on before you decide whether you are in a place to undertake a successful capital campaign. We'll go through them one by one here. I think it'll lead to a lot of good discussion. So the first thing you say in practical terms that you should check yourself on if you're thinking about doing a capital campaign, because you don't want to fail at these things, right? I mean, the last thing you want to do is start a capital campaign that doesn't work, right? Like, that's bad.
Yeah, yeah. Indeed.
Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So don't feel bad if that's happened to you and you're on this call, but we're trying to avoid that. So the first thing you say people should do is check with leadership. But does leadership have what it takes to meet the goals of the campaign? What do you mean by that? And what are we looking for specifically?
Yeah. I like to say that, leaders need I don't think I use this exact language, in that article, but, leaders need the will. They need the professional and personal will to see the campaign from its beginning days, in the planning phase to and if they choose to move forward with it, to the final days, to the very final, gift that comes in that puts them over the edge. So it's really about, professional will and personal will to do what it takes to make it happen. So.
We talk about leaders. Are we talking about board leadership? Are we talking about staff leadership? And on the staff, are we talking about just development department? Are we talking about the C-suite people? Who are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Yeah, and Chris, feel free to chime in. But I think essentially it is the person or people who are going to actually be making decisions, primarily decisions related to, connecting the, prospective donors with the actual case that you're trying to, the actual content of your campaign. So sure, there might be board chair or board members. It could be the executive director, it could be the development director, but it's that one person or that group of people who are really going to make it happen. Meaning connecting case with, the prospect. That's what I mean by that. The people actually in the trenches doing the work.
And
Chris, yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask you before you go on. Can you be successful if your board is not all in on a capital campaign?
I don't think so. I think that there are some people who are going to look and say, did 100% of your board give a gift? They're never going to ask how much that they gave, but they want to know that everybody gave and was supportive. I think that it's okay, and I may be on a limb here, but I think we've all worked with organizations or been part of organizations that had a cantankerous board member or two, right? That kind of they view their role as to be generally opposed to everything, and I think that person is fine. It doesn't have to be a absolute unanimous. Everybody thinks everything about this is terrific. However, the board has to be behind this because they can make your life so difficult that if they're not excited about it, it's going to be tough. And then in that same vein, I think your executive leadership, whoever that CEO, president is, they have to have the respect of the staff and the respect of the donors. If they're missing one of those, it's going to be a great challenge. Every once in a while, you can take somebody who's moderately loved by the donors and has a chief of or a head of the board who is beloved, and that can work. But it's very challenging to make that happen.
How do you know, Chris, I'll stay with you on this. Scott talks in the article about getting a determined yes. I like that phrase very much. A determined yes from leadership is the first box we need to check if we're going to do a capital campaign. How do you know if you really have a determined yes? Number one, and part two of this question, how do you manufacture a determined yes if you don't have one?
I think that sometimes development people think we're not very successful raising money, partly maybe in this situation because our leader isn't as determined. And so what I'll do is I'll create a campaign that helps make up some of what's lacking there, which that's pretty common to want to jump into, but that the leader doesn't really believe in things. The challenge is that halfway through the campaign, they might change the priorities of the campaign. So I think that where you have to get them is to a point where they say, these are the priorities of the campaign of the next couple of years from my perspective. And I think this is the right dollar amount. If you can't agree on priorities and dollar amount, then you're not close enough at that point. So I have been a part of that group, that fundraising group that pulled maybe pulled the leadership along, and eventually got told, well, the tail is wagging the dog because the development department is trying to lead. And we said, we're putting to paper what you've been talking about for years. And so we're sorry you feel like this, but the tail needs wagged. So
Right.
we're gonna lead from the front, and we got a little bit into the campaign before everybody kind of jumped on board. And I think that can be okay, but it is risky.
Yeah, that sounds like a higher risk strategy for getting something going.
Yes, it
What do you
is.
think?
And that was with a leader who was phenomenal, and very respected by staff and board, but wasn't sure if they wanted to commit to exactly what the goals were. That was the challenge for them.
What are your thoughts on that, Scott, in terms of how do you know you have a determined yes, and how do you get one if you don't?
At a very pragmatic level, I mean, and at the board level, just having a board vote, right? Lots of discussion. Board
I was going to
vote,
ask
you get it in the minutes.
Yeah. A formal board vote's a good way to make sure you have that determined yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's one very, very basic, thing to do that just puts it in writing, right? So, and then the board, is given an opportunity to, argue about it, but they then have to at some point before moving forward and giving the leader, by leader I mean executive director, president, so forth. They've had their opportunity to say what they want to say, but then they vote on it, and if it's a yes, it's a determined yes, it's in writing, and that leader has permission to go forward.
What about the idea of maybe going ahead and getting, what do you think of getting a feasibility study undertaken as a way of trying to get you to that point of getting the determined yes? Is that a good strike? Is it worthwhile to do a feasibility if you're not sure whether you have that?
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people on the call probably know all about feasibility studies, and some may not. But yeah, certainly a feasibility study or a planning study is a great way for the leadership team or the leader and the board to really think through all of the details and to assess whether they have the capacity to be successful.
Go ahead and give us, Scott, the 1 minute, like what a feasibility study is thing for those who may not know.
Yep. So a feasibility study is testing whether your organization is ready to conduct a campaign that will be successful. So you're testing the feasibility, whether a campaign can be successful or not. And you don't want to move forward if you haven't almost proven that you have a very good chance of being successful with your campaign. So that would include developing a preliminary case for support, a document that's kind of capturing what you think you're going to pursue. It's going to mean engaging some of your best prospects or a nice diverse representation of your stakeholders, presenting that preliminary case, getting their feedback, their thoughts on messaging, their thoughts on the actual project you're thinking about, and just being very uniform in that approach with all of these stakeholders that you're presenting the case to, listening to. And also involves sort of a comprehensive organizational audit or development audit, just understanding the history of your organization and fundraising, it's the overall organizational health, which is more than just fundraising, but seeing if you have the actual organizational health, just to use that language again, whether you're ready, whether the organization has all that it needs to, the grit, check.
Yeah. Part of that. Now, somebody just asked, and it's a good question in the chat, but do you always do a feasibility study before you do a capital campaign, or can you skip that?
Yeah, I would say the default answer is always do a feasibility study. I've seen, recently some organizations, great organizations that said, we just got to do this campaign. We need the money. So it doesn't matter what a study is going to say, we have to do it.
Yeah.
And
I've been in all those conversations myself. There could be a little bit troubling.
So that maybe that's the case, but I think, a study of some kind, and you find some other way to, some other name for it, but a planning study where you still get in front of people, and which is then it's more cultivation and setting you up for making some of those initial asks, rather than a yes or no.
What I would in, Scott, is I think that I think that leaders often think that a feasibility study is about determining whether or not you're able to, and they say, well, I know we can, so why would we do one?
Right.
But the feasibility study, it is critical because that's the point at which you introduce it to your top donors, your top potential donors, and allow them to come alongside you in the planning process. So it's not, we have this great plan and all we need is your money. It's, we're thinking of a plan and we want you to come alongside with us and help write it so that later you can underwrite it. And so it's really I think that we've often found success with leaders who are like that to reframe it. Instead of calling this the feasibility study, we're going to call it the planning study or something similar, where they don't feel like you're going to tell them, no, you shouldn't do a study at the end, but they realize this is part of getting the donors engaged.
Yeah. Well, so that's the answer I was hoping you would get to. Feasibility studies actually can help you get to the determined yes, or determine whether you can't get a determined yes with your campaign. But even if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt you're going to go forward, it's still important to do because it's the best way to engage your top donors.
That's right.
It engages them in a way where they feel involved in the design of the campaign, its conceptualization, and not like a fait accompli is being presented to them without their input. Correct?
Yeah. Yep.
So, great question.
Can I tell one quick story?
Yeah, please do.
And this is at the possible offense of our friend from UPenn. When I've worked at other organizations, oftentimes when leadership was hesitant to do a campaign, but what I did is I put together like one of the universities that they really respected and respected their fundraising, is I put together a historical chart of their campaigns and showed them that every 7 years this university launches a campaign.
Right.
So you love that they've raised so much money and you think I could do so much more with $1 trillion investment fund, endowment fund than they could. Why do they have so much money? They have so much money because they do a campaign every 7 years, and that's why we should do one, at least one. Is because it's a great way to raise a transformative amount of money. So
as long as we check off all the boxes in our grit check, of course.
That's right.
Right. To bring it back to that. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's that's great. I mean, you're right, Chris. I mean, people want to be like universities, but then they don't want to do the kind of work that a university department does. And typically universities are sort of the best practices people in this sector, and certainly in this.
Yeah.
Let's go to number 2 on the grit check assessment that we're doing, whether you're ready to do a capital campaign, and that's prospects. You have to have enough prospects, both in terms of just quality and quantity, or quantity and quality, I should say. Right, Scott? So again, elaborate on that for us. What do you need?
Yeah.
What are you looking at here?
Yeah, and I'd add another word, quantity of prospects, so a sufficient number, actual numbers who have an affinity. I would add that, you could have,
prospects and people on a list.
Yeah, you have 10,000 donors, and they all love your organization, but if your capital campaign is about this, well, do all 10,000 have an affection, an affinity for that particular project that you want to campaign for? And then capacity, because most campaigns, if not all campaigns, are going to be successful because a relatively small number of donors raise most of the money. And so you need.
What's the ratio there, Scott? Is it the 80-20 rule?
Yeah, it's the Pareto principle, the 80-20. And I'm hearing from others, in doing campaigns that sometimes it's even 90-10, 95%,
95-5,
coming from 5%. So, which it could be kind of demoralizing to some people that don't have a lot of major gift level donors. But that's one of the facts one has to face.
Right.
Is that you can't just ask everybody. If everybody gave $1,000 or everybody gave, whatever, we'd be successful. It just does not happen. So
that is not how. That's a really good point to make. People will think like, well, we don't have anybody with big money, but everybody give $1,000 and we have 4,000 of them. So that will work out. And that 4,000 people are not going to give you 1,000 unless you're Penn, okay, or Oklahoma State. I'm seeing the big boys in the chat box, maybe,
Yep.
But
but even a big university like that with like 300,000 living alumni or whatever, they may have, I would venture to say most aren't giving.
Yeah.
Right. So you got to focus on, the 30-40% that are. So
Chris, what percentage of, we go to this prospects now, let's say, okay, it's going to be 80-20 or 85-15, 85% of the money is going to come from 15% of the donors who give to the campaign. How much of that do you need to identify before you start on the campaign? And I'm putting you on the spot here. By the way, none of this is rehearsed. So everybody knows. Scott and Chris have no idea what questions I'm going to ask them. So they may say, I don't know sometimes, but what do you need to know before you start?
One of the biggest things that I think is surprising to people because is the amount of money that you're going to raise in the quiet phase. So this is with many of the people who did a feasibility study, and then you move into a quiet phase where you're telling people about it, but it's not a public announcement. You kind of still reserve the right to change some of the priorities, change the goal amount, and you need to raise 50 to 70% of the funds before you go public. One of the visuals I like to think of is when you look at the fundraising thermometer. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody's fundraising thermometer where they were like a quarter of the way through the bubble. And the thing that goes through my mind is, oh man, they're in trouble.
Never going to make it.
You got to mostly be able to fill up the bubble with people who are already really close to you, who you're pretty confident of their giving, because you can't go public before that time. So so the short answer is probably about 50%. You need to feel really good about being able to get to 50% because surprise gifts or gifts you don't know about can make up a lot of the campaign, but it can't make up more than 50% of the campaign.
Yeah, I concur with that. Something north of 50% for sure.
I like
that. Chris,
70. It is a solid 70-75% or higher before they go public.
Yeah.
What percentage? Speaking of prospects, what percentage of prospects for a campaign realistically can come from outside your current file of givers? Like, is it realistic to think that maybe 10% of your campaign givers won't even be current donors? 20%, 2%? What do we think?
Yeah. So I've worked for an organization that heavily relied on unaffiliated donors, and that we did count on those who we hadn't even met yet making significant campaign gifts.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to do that because we had historical information that we were really good at that. Our major donor this year almost always had not given us a gift 4 years ago. That was something we just excelled at. That is very atypical to happen. I would say if it's a 3-year campaign or a 5-year campaign, you could count on something like 10 to 15% coming from that type of a situation if you have already shown that you're good at that. But for instance, a church is not good at getting unaffiliated donors generally and has no experience doing it. So I would never recommend that a church do that. But if you're good at it and have experience, I think you can say 10 to 15%.
Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, it depends on the type of organization. If you have an and the mission of your organization, are you a national organization and then could appeal to the whole country, or are you an organization that does something like ministry on university campuses, or feeding, like putting wells, in Africa or something like that? It's interesting, and people have an affinity for that all over the country.
Right.
But if you're a focused, human services organization in a particular city, well, you're not going to get people from another city to give to you because they have their own issues they're trying to solve. So
no, that's a good point. That what's the potential pool of prospects, donors to you generally? That percentage. But I think we're giving people the idea here that if you're thinking 50% of your campaign gifts are going to come from outside your current file, that's not going to happen. It's highly unlikely to happen, even if you have a 3 to 5 year time horizon. It's going to be you should be planning something much smaller than that percentage. And that means you may have to work on building your file for a while, which is often what people do need to do.
Yeah, or coming up with a reason for your campaign, a case statement that's true to who you are, true to your mission. Is not going to lead to mission drift, but will attract other people. You know.
Don't jump ahead, Scott. That's number 4. Get into the case. All right. We'll move on to number 3. Okay, so you got to have leadership. They got to have they have to be behind it. I think we've established that. Although there could be a couple of cantankerous board members, maybe who aren't, and the feasibility can help bring them along. You have to have enough prospects, and they have to have enough money. They have enough capacity, right, and enough affinity, which Scott pointed out. We didn't talk about that, but I think that's something to take. Definitely, you need to determine if the affinity is there for your project, what you're raising the money for this capital campaign. The third thing you need is a plan. You need to be able to, you have to have a whole plan. And this surprises people sometimes, I think, when we're working with them. Like, there's a whole other campaign plan that you have to build. It's different than your annual fund plan. But it's also detailed and robust, right? Scott, I'll go start with you again since you wrote the article.
Yeah. I mean, you need a written plan, and I guess in some cases, a 1-page plan might be sufficient, but it might be a, 30 to 40 page plan, but you need a plan that is clear to you, clear to your team, the people who are, or your volunteers who are going to actually be doing the hard work of inviting people to support the campaign. And I think an important element of a campaign are benchmarks, a timeline, and then benchmarks you're going to try to hit, on that timeline. Like, we're going to try to solicit 50 people by this date, or we're going to try to raise, $500,000 by this date.
Specific process goals and numbers, right? Not just outcome goals, but like you said, like 50, solicit 12 people a month or whatever.
Yep. And then that's going back to the leadership, the needing to have the will, the ambition to make this campaign successful. Benchmarks on a timeline are motivating. So obviously, if you're not hitting them, which happens all the time, it's an opportunity to kind of regroup and say, all right, what can we be doing differently or better as leaders? What can we let's reevaluate our prospects and our approach to those prospects. There's something about our case statement, which we'll get to next, that we need to tweak or message differently. So the plan is something that is meant to be a living plan, a playbook that you're referencing, regularly, but also adjusting as you actually face reality.
Chris, Scott said something in his article, which I think is really good, is that even your major donors, not just inviting them to see the play, but to see the stage directions and the script. That's one reason to do a plan, is that they want to know you have a plan, and so they can see where they fit in. Is that what you find?
That's right. And if they're going to give a major gift, they want to know that you're going to be able to finish the rest of the campaign. So I think that a plan allows them to have confidence to be able to be looking at those benchmarks and say, okay, they're on track. I feel good about this. I think that one of the things that is our responsibility as development staff is to help our leaders create those plans and be ready for those plans. Too often, they're the team captain who's like, we're ready to win the game. Let's go out on the field. And you're supposed to be the coach. And you're like, we haven't done a playbook yet. You've got to have a playbook before you can take the field. And we often get phone calls from organizations that they're ready to launch a capital campaign, so they'd like to get help. No, you need help 6 months before you're ready to launch a capital campaign, or you're not ready to launch one, because you've got to put all these pieces into place before you start talking to donors. They don't want to commit to a 6-figure gift if you don't have a plan in place.
Yeah. And how does the gift table come into this, Chris? I think people are probably all familiar with the gift table. If you're not, philanthropydaily.com has some good articles on it. But certainly when you do a capital campaign, you're always creating a table of gifts. to
Right.
show how you can reach your goal, your $10 million goal, your $100 million goal, your $1 billion goal. What the gifts you need each level. Do you show that to donors, and if so, like why?
100%. And that. And I think that in order to solicit those major gifts, a campaign is almost always a transformative amount of money for your organization. And in a campaign more than anywhere else, you need that table of gifts defined so that because chances are the people you're asking for the gift have never thought of that amount. And in one campaign I was a part of, we asked the lead donor for $10 million, and we asked him to be the campaign chair. And he said, I was ready for you to come and ask me for $1 million. And we had talked about that already, but I'm going to need some time to think about this,
Yeah.
And that was a happy response. And thankfully for the organization, he decided to make that gift. But in order to raise that much money, they don't know that 50% of the gifts need to come in the quiet phase, 50 to 70%. And they don't know that the top 12 gifts are going to make up 30%. And so you need a table of gifts to introduce them to those ideas and to broaden their horizons.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes you are broadening horizon, helping imagine a different level of giving, among a different level of support and engagement. There's a good question in the chat. I'll pitch this to Scott. There are reluctant leaders, and then there are over enthusiastic leaders. So how do you reel them back in if they're ahead of you in terms of plan, feasibility, numbers?
Yeah. It's an important, so we should sit on this for a little bit to discuss the whole concept of a quiet phase, which should be in a campaign plan.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the text, the question there, and again, the cat may be out of the bag. The leader may be already, they've gone public with the campaign, public with small groups of people around the school or around the organization or what have you, or they've just started, talking about it in emails and all over the place. That's problematic, but as much as one is able to, and depending on one's position in the organization, you want to try to encourage, a quiet phase. So in the planning phase, but with somebody who's overly ambitious, just encourage them to pull back. It may be too late to pull back, but there may be certain tactics that one can do to pull back a little bit in order to protect oneself from failure.
Yeah, I think I would want to answer the question here from Stephen. And by the way, this is a safe space in the chat box. We will not report back to your organizational leader the question you have asked about him or her. And I'm sure that's nothing to do with your organizational leader. You may be just talking about, hey, we got to give this the best chance of being successful that we can. And that's going to come with us going in a pretty disciplined process, and let's talk about how we can kind of fit your enthusiasm into a more disciplined process just to make sure that we give ourselves the best chance of being successful. All of this depends on your leaders' willingness to listen. If they're not willing to listen, there's maybe not much you can do. Scott or Chris, do you have thoughts on this question?
I think that if I were in that position, the number one thing I would do is create a table of gifts and make the leader take it with them to the board and say, do you believe we can raise these gifts? And when they meet with them one-on-one, where do you see yourself fitting in? So I've worked with those enthusiastic leaders, and I love them because it's a whole lot easier to direct somebody who wants to run fast in the right direction than it is to move someone who doesn't want to run and try to get them to run. But I think you may be wrong, right? They may be right. The only way you can do that is by testing in those situations. And that's what a feasibility study does. We worked with an organization where a very wealthy person was someone they thought would be the chair of the campaign and make a multi-7 or maybe 8-figure gift. And they did want to chair the campaign, and they said, I could see myself giving as much as 500,000, and felt really strong about that. And it blew the leader's mind that that's what they thought was a really amazing gift. and the person needed to see a table of gifts and kind of slot themselves in before the leader said, okay, maybe this does take more cultivation than I thought.
Good. That's good. I like that. In part what I would do too is, but as I said, but also like just I'd also try to run to catch up too. Like I wouldn't stay high bound in we got to do it. Like, okay, can you give us 2 weeks to throw together a plan to build around what you're doing? Can we get this table of gifts at least built up? I'm going to do a feasibility study just because I think that's going to give us the best chance to get people to give the size of gifts that we need. I don't know if that's.
And I think you have to be careful, because when a leader wants to run fast and they fear you pulling from behind, their natural reaction is going to be to run harder, to pull you with them. And so you actually may be accidentally causing the opposite reaction that you desire by not showing them that you're willing to be beside them.
To run hard too. Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenge. It sounds like you have a visionary leader, a visionary dynamic leader you're with, and those are always challenging to work with if you're trying in a number of ways. But they also create different opportunities than non-visionary, non-dynamic leaders.
Or a friend of his has. I don't know that this is his particular situation.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, his friend, right? This is not Stephen's situation. All right. Okay, very good. So but generally speaking, we want to plan, and the plan's going to have goals, strategies, tasks. At least that's how I think of plans. I guess how we usually break them down. There are various ways to create a plan, but goals, which means benchmarks, the strategies by which you're going to attempt to reach those goals, and then breaking down those strategies into concrete, timelined tasks. The fourth thing, doing this grit check, is the case statement. You can have a plan, you can have capacity and a quantity of prospects you need, you can have the leadership, but you also have to make your case. You can't just sort of like bring out a gift table that needs to be accompanied by a narrative, a case for why you're raising this money. So what are the key things there, Scott, to consider to put together a really good case statement?
Yeah. I think about case statements all the time, and I love thinking about them and creating them. And so lately, what I've been thinking a lot about just how important emotion is to campaign case statements. That they need to be not overly detailed in all of the intricacies of what your building's going to look like and what this program's going to do. Those things are important. Elements of those things need to be in a case statement, but it needs to be an emotional appeal, to your stakeholders. So that's something I've just been thinking a lot about, and trying to take case statements more and more in that direction.
That's a good point. It's a very key thing of any case, not just for your capital campaigns, but for your entire development pitch. Ethos is more important than logos. Logos comes along, a reason comes. We have to break in with pathos, emotion, affect, and I think that's a really good point, because we can tend to get pointy-headed sometimes, and where we get wrapped up in our own programs. Well, this is going to allow us to do these 4 things, and these 4 things allow us to do these 3 things, or we have very detailed budgets, renderings are great because they speak to pathos. Like you can see it, like your heart a bit. We can see a good rendering of this building, where it's going to be. Story, right, is important to that. Chris, what do you think? What would you say about a case statement? Like, what are you looking for when you see a good capital campaign case statement?
What I want to see, first of all, is that you put it down on paper. And that's actually, we talked earlier about how to bring a leader along who's too ambitious. Is if you write it down and give them something to disagree with, they'll say, no, that's not what I want to do at all. And you can say, well, you actually haven't said what you want to do. You identified one of the 5 key parts, and you said a lot about that, but the other 4 you haven't worked out yet. And I think that in doing that, in putting it down on paper, it shows donors that you've thought through this, and that you have multiple avenues for them to enter into. I don't think it's important for it to be an overly designed piece. I mean, I'm happy to work with draft case statement if it's a 5-year campaign, I'm fine with a draft case statement for 3 years. That's just fine. I want donors, but there has to be something that puts your ideas on paper so that donors can read it, and then you can find out what they really think. Because if it's just the organizational leader talking, if they're a great, if they're somebody who everybody loves, they're going to shake their head, and the organizational leader will come back and say they loved it. They thought everything was perfect. And if they're a less charismatic leader, they're going to say, oh, I don't know. But putting it on paper allows you to really let the donor enter into the plan and get their real feedback from it.
I like that, Chris. Just that in certain campaigns and in a quiet phase or even the planning phase, just having your case statement be a preliminary case statement, potentially for a long time.
Yep.
Or at least you're presented as a preliminary case statement there, which means it's open to change and tweaks and all that. So
at least in theory.
At least in theory, right?
Yeah, that's really good. Now, there's a question in the chat box. It's a really good one. It doesn't quite go to the case statement. It maybe goes back to the plan, but it's something we haven't talked about. But it's a frequent aspect of capital campaigns, and that's naming opportunities. Building something, and often you will attach naming opportunities or sponsorship opportunities to particular aspects of whatever it is you're building: the flagpole, the foyer, the gym, the classroom. The question in the box, in the chat box here is that how do you get leaders, your board, to understand that a campaign is more than just slapping names on rooms? That it's about the broader mission of the organization. Do you guys have any thoughts on how to answer Megan's question?
One of the exercises, depending on where you are with them, that I like to do with boards is to ask them, why do you support, right? Like, it's just kind of a start off exercise as part of a board development meeting. You don't have to say, I'm doing this so that I can show you naming opportunities don't matter. You could have a start off of, just to build enthusiasm for what we're doing. I'd like everybody to go around and share, why did you make your first gift, and what inspired you to make your best gift about this organization? And I think that really helps people to see nobody in that room gave because of a naming opportunity, right? And then I think you could say there are a handful of donors out there, a very small percentage, who like to name things. Most people decide to give the gift and then think it's wonderful that they got to name something.
Right. It's an incredible add-on. Like, are you kidding me? Really? If I get to honor my mom or my grandparents or whatever, it could be all, not just them, right? It could be somebody else, or our family's name's going to be on this. It's tremendous.
Your classroom is not so amazing that the donor can't wait to get their name on it.
I think Chris, that's a great answer for Megan's question. Hopefully that'll be helpful to you, Megan. Campaigns are more than just about that. So maybe you can introduce the board into, like, here's how I would think about a campaign. I would think about these 5 steps, and the naming is just part of it. What do you think? You could be maybe open-ended about it and say, I think we need to get all of this right, and then really opens up our opportunities for success much more dramatically. And as Chris says, naming is only going to take you so far.
Another thing, again, I'm probably getting granular, but I love Jerry Panis. What an amazing man. But he wrote a great book called Mega Gifts, and he did a great survey with major donors about why they gave the largest gift they'd given, and presenting that to the board. And I know you'd be presenting it a little bit as fact, and it's probably a 15-year-old survey, informal survey at this point, but it still is meaningful because of the person who wrote it.
Yeah, good point. Let's answer one more question from the chat box before we get to our 5th and final thing on this grit check thing. One of our Doler attendees, a man named Austin Detweiler, has asked a question. I can say he's Doler because he works with me. And so I don't know why he's asking this question. Maybe it's to help him with the client. What do you do if you're not going to succeed? I mean, you're getting close. it's the end of year 3. It was a 3-year, $20 million campaign. It was a 5-year, $200 million campaign, and you're sitting at 125. It's a great question, actually.
It is.
What do you do?
I would say try not to end. So I mean, built into that question is, well, it's a given that you're going to end. There's a stop date, and everybody knows there's a stop date to this campaign. If that's the case, that makes the question a little harder to answer. But I would try not to end the campaign. Keep going until you. But if that's not the best answer, and it's just everybody knows in the church or the organization or the college or what have you that they said this is a 3-year campaign and we're getting to the end here on May 30th or whatever. Then it becomes sort of a PR messaging dilemma that you have to tweak. I mean, those are my initial thoughts. I mean, Chris, you have any thoughts to add on that?
COVID brought us so many bad things. We need to take advantage of the blessings it's given too. And I would absolutely say, because of COVID, we're extending 100%. I mean,
that's good.
Blame on everything bad for the next 3 years, basically.
Right. Anything bad. Now, I would only do that if I thought that I could actually get significantly closer to the goal with another year. If I'd already asked everybody I thought could give a gift, that's not going to help, right?
Right.
And I think that at that point, what you'd have to do is have a heart-to-heart with your executive director or leader and say, I think we need to go out to the community and say, after carefully looking at things through 2020, we realized that perhaps we were more ambitious than is needed right now, or to say we've decided to delay parts of the campaign for an additional 2 years, or you could say something that essentially says we've realized we can do almost as much with less money. It frames it somewhat positively.
Always frame positively.
You can't do any of those things. You could say because of COVID, we've decided to break this into 2 phases.
Right.
The first phase ends now, and the second phase will begin in 2 years.
And the first phase was incredibly successful.
Incredibly successful.
We're able to do X, Y, and Z. And you know what? The wisest course of action right now, we're phase 2. Yeah, exactly. I think there's a way to phrase. Look, this is like Scott said. There's a PR spin to everything, and Chris just gave you some good examples of maybe how you could do that.
It's a good question to be asking. Having a plan for that. Like if you're 6 months from the end or a year from the end, what are you going to do? And so you've already come up with your answer.
Yeah, that's right.
Beforehand. So.
Thinking about what your plausible answer might be, although keep trying to succeed, as Scott said originally. All right, we have 10 minutes to go, so I want to get through the 5th thing, and then if there's time, maybe a little time for any more questions that people have. The 5th thing you need, the grit check. We got to copyright this or trademark it or something, Scott. To be successful in a capital campaign is investment, and this is something that sometimes, much to our chagrin, in our business, is like, what, really? So to raise an extra $50 million, I'm going to have to invest in additional staff and additional time into a campaign, but that's really the case, right? You can't raise the kind of transformative money we're talking about, the capital campaign, just with your regular annual fund development staff, right?
Yeah, usually not. I mean, I suppose if you had, staff members who could really ramp up their hours and their time commitment, which is unlikely and probably very unreasonable and unhealthy to expect. You're going to need to bring on another staff member, depending on the size of your organization, the size of the campaign goal, several people potentially. So, which is a scary thought, when you're potentially adding 100,000, several 100,000, millions in certain organizations. But you have to just, count the cost, and in relation to how much you're going to expect to raise. Is it $1 million? Is it $10 million? What have you? And a certain percentage, whether that's 2, 5, 7 or 8% of that campaign goal is going to need to be spent on, making sure that you're going to be successful. So primarily staff, but also added travel. If you're a national organization, then you have donors or prospective donors across the country. You're going to have an increased travel budget, increased mailing and printing budget. Maybe your campaign would be served well by a short film. You got a budget for that. Maybe video, maybe an event or two or a series of events would be appropriate for your situation. There's rental costs and food costs and so forth. So you got to just add on, and I'd probably do a separate budget, potentially with a separate bank account even, so to provide transparency and accountability for yourselves, as well as to demonstrate to donors that you're keeping campaign dollars separate from the big bucket. So,
Chris, 2 questions for you. What is the right percentage, do you think, that you should kind of expect to have to invest in order to reach a campaign goal? And the second thing is, where do you find that? Do you just have to take that out of your cash reserves, if you have any, or is it at all normal to ask for a donor or two to help cover those costs?
Mm-hmm. I think it depends on how you're looking at your fundraising costs overall. A campaign is going to cost a certain percentage more than what you're currently expending. I think that over the life of a campaign, somewhere between 8 and 10% is going to be spent on overall fundraising costs, right? That might even be a little bit low. That's not all additional cost. That's part of the staff that you're already employing, that 10%. But if you're going to do a $20 million campaign over 3 years, you're probably going to spend $2 million getting there between events and all those things. So I would say 10% all in. The second question is, I think that a feasibility study is especially good to ask a donor to fund, because you can say, we want to raise $20 million, or we want to raise $5 million. Would you give X dollars to see if we're able to do that? And at least to the donor in that moment, it's going to sound like they're getting like 100X compared to their gift, because you're going to show that you can raise this huge campaign if they just give this smaller gift.
Right.
So I think that's a very strong ask. And I think that if your organization, part of me wants to say, and this is off the cuff, and if your organization doesn't have anybody who's close enough and cares enough about you to fund a feasibility study, then you might not have anybody who cares enough about you to do a campaign to begin with.
You have an unfeasible campaign goal, probably. I was part of an endowment campaign, so a little bit different than a capital campaign here in Phoenix that has had an $80 million goal for its endowment. And we were able to pitch a $5 million investment in the organization that would make it capable of raising this $80 million in endowment funds, plus some other things too. And got it. They found a donor who was a highly engaged, highly invested supporter of this organization that was willing to step up and say, yeah, I get it. Like a $5 million investment over, I think it was 5 years, to produce an $80 million endowment that will only go up within 5 years, is a great investment for us. So that's my experience, is you can find people. One of the places to, and that's like the best investment that you could get, right, in a capital campaign, and someone to pay for the additional staff and events and expenses and stuff is going to take to run this sucker. The worst thing you can do, this is just my opinion now, you guys are the experts, but we see this. Scott and I see this. I know, because it's you get started, it's a $20 million campaign, the $100 million campaign, and you're not, the accounting office is expecting no additional monies to be spent in order to raise this amount. That's just utterly unrealistic. And you don't want to fight getting into that situation as much as you can, no business person thinks that you increase your revenue as an organization from 20 million to 100 million without making investments. They shouldn't think the same thing about a capital campaign.
On the, are you willing to make the investment grit check? one of the other important elements is the leader willing to spend the time meeting with the donor? So I like to, in situations where that might be a concern, to map out the number of meetings and the amount of hours and the number of days the campaign is going to need from that individual to make this a success.
I like
That's
that.
good. Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually,
Development generally.
one campaign that I worked on, or that I was working with, they were considering it, and at the end of the day, they said, the leader said, "I'd rather not do the campaign than give any of my time to it." So they pulled the plug, which was the right decision. I'm like, thank goodness we found that out now instead of after they started.
Yeah.
It's really true. I mean, I remember this is not a campaign thing. Once working on a strategic organizational plan with a leader, and I finally ended up asking him, like, well, hey, do you want this organization to go on and flourish after you're gone? And he said, not particularly. I'm like, okay, good. That changes the character of this plan considerably. Like, we're not really trying to build a sustainable organization. We're just trying to get you through till retirement. Different story entirely. Well, I hope that was helpful for people. Anything else you guys would like to add? We just have a couple of minutes here, Scott and Chris. If we don't have any other questions right now in the chat box, I hope I'm not missing anything in the Q&A or anything. Nope, I don't think I am. So anything else you guys would like to add before we go?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to us, one of us, all of us, with other questions, or if you want to set up a time to talk, we'd be happy to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also Katie just told me I'm supposed to note our podcast, which is not just about capital campaigns. It's called Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Available at all the podcast places. So another thing is Scott has an article coming out tomorrow on philanthropydaily.com about feasibility studies in particular. So if that is something you're interested in, more elaboration on, you can look at Philanthropy Daily tomorrow, and that will be on there. All right. Well, with that, thank you everybody for being here. We really appreciate it. Don't forget the webinar and masterclass on the same topic. If you are interested, go to americanphilanthropic.com, and there you can go to events, and you can find those things and register right there. And we appreciate your being with us today. Thanks, Chris and Scott. And
thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. It's always nice to have an excuse to finish a scotch.
Finish yours. I got some left in mine. I'm impressed, Chris. Well, it's an hour later in Denver than it is here.
That's right.
Thank you all for joining us.